Hey guys, today we're going to talk about the Stamp Act controversy. And while technically it was sort of part of lecture 4, I wanted to make sure that you guys understand it well because it's so important in understanding the American Revolution and where a lot of the founding fathers and the American people are coming from during the Revolution. And so last week when you were studying, you were learning about these different acts that were happening. The Navigation Act, you learned about the Sugar Act, Quartering Act, um, and all stems from the fact that the British are in debt to the tune of about 140 million pounds. And so what happens is about half of that 140 million pounds comes from the French and Indian War, that 7 years war, both from defending the colonists in the Americas and the actual fighting that was happening in Europe. And as we've discussed earlier, especially when we looked at mercantilism, the British hate to be in debt. And so what's going to happen is the British Parliament comes to this realization that the British people in England get taxed very, very heavily. And in fact, they still do. The British are probably one of the most taxed societies in the world as far as tax on your income. But they offer a whole lot of extra amenities as well that, like, say, the United States doesn't, for example. But anyway, then, like now, the British tax their citizens very, very heavily. And since so much of this debt came from the French and Indian War, and of that debt, so much came from defending the colonies, Parliament thinks the American people should at least pay at least a third of the debt that was incurred protecting them, housing soldiers, etc. So they start passing these various acts that, of course, the American colonists are very resistant to. And the one that really does hurt them the most is the Stamp Act. The reason that the Stamp Act is so controversial is because it was more all-encompassing of what they would actually use. With the Sugar Act, the British could sneak in other sugar from other places, like in the Barbados and different places in the West Indies. It didn't necessarily have to be British sugar. They just sort of would smuggle other things. But the Stamp Act, this idea of for various documents, whether it was a marriage license, whether it was stationery, playing cards, paper, all these different things had to have a British stamp on it. And there were different kinds of stamps you could have. Okay? And so these are some of the stamps that would have been put on your document if as needed. But this becomes much more difficult. Most legal documents have to have the stamp on it. And again, it's not all that expensive. It's really about a penny. They're actually not going to make that much money at all on the Stamp Act when all this is said and done. The British make almost no money whatsoever. I think it's like about £200. I mean, it really is a little ridiculous. But the American colonists just get absolutely outraged. And so there does become this idea of no taxation without representation to the colonist of, if you're going to tax us, then we expect representation in Parliament so we can discuss and stand up for ourselves saying we don't want to be taxed. To the British, you have to think of it also from their perspective. The Americans are their colony. They are not equal to the mother country, to England. No other colony is asking for representation. You don't have South Africa. You don't have the parts in Asia. You don't have the Caribbean parts. So for the colonies to come and say, we want representation in your parliament, the British are almost laughing at this to the point of, how dare you even ask for such a thing? This is absolutely ludicrous. Never in the history has the colonizing country asked for the same rights as the mother country's citizens. And so to the British, I really want you to understand this, because I think as kids, when we grew up in the United States, the American Revolution just makes it sound like the British are these mean, horrible, like ogres, and they don't listen to us, and we're all for freedom. And there is some truth to that, don't get me wrong. But if you look at it from a British perspective, they really and truly cannot understand what the colonists are upset about. Their taxes are low. They're barely taxing them at all, especially compared to mother country citizens. And here you have, and here you then have these colonists who say, oh, and by the way, we want representation in Parliament, and that's just to the British crazy. I mean, how they wouldn't even think of it. So, the American colonists start their own different ideas of um, defying the act. The biggest being, of course, a non-importation agreement. They just stop buying British goods. And some of it's really hard because some of it they really want. Like they really want their tea, or they really want sugar, or they really want paper or clothing. And the colonists band together. They start doing like homespun clothing drives where the women take other materials not normally used and start making clothing so they don't have to buy British cloth or British clothing. They start, just not using paper or reusing old paper. I mean, they're doing all these different ideas to not have to import anything. And the colonists kind of band together with this non-importation agreement. And the Stamp Act really does bring the colonists together, whether you live in New England or the Middle Colonies or the Southern Colonies. It really will bring you together. Now, it's way more focused on in New England. I definitely want you to understand that, and you'll understand more as you read Chapter 5. New England's the hotbed of where this activity is going. This is where the most outrage is. It's where most of the fighting is going to happen at the beginning. So the Stamp Act Congress specifically is going to be founded in New England, is going to appear, and their big idea is to help spread the word about non-importation agreements. And they write up a list of grievances and send it to King George III, telling him how this act grieves the American colonists, how upset they are, how unfair it is, and they have to get representation. Parliament is finally going to repeal the act the next year in 1766, just from the amount of scrutiny and the amount of pressure they're getting from British merchants telling them America is their absolute greatest trading partner, even though it's definitely part of the empire. And they're telling Parliament, you've got to repeal this because they're not buying our goods and we're losing money. And the British, they don't like to lose money. So Parliament repeals the act, but places the Declaratory Act in place in that same year, saying that Parliament has the right to tax and pass another act in the future, and that the American colonists have to follow it no matter what. And so it's one of those, kind of like a parent, where you might give in a little bit, but you're telling that kid, listen, I gave in to you on this one time, but next time you're going to have to do what I tell you to do. And so the Declaratory Act is passed in 1766, and the Americans feel like they really won something, because it was getting somewhat violent. One of the offshoots of the Stamp Act Congress is something called the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. And they are sort of they don't really want to fight the Stamp Act in a more diplomatic means. There's more physical. Sometimes they tar and feather effigies of tax collectors. In a few instances, they actually tar and feather the collectors. And I really want you to understand that this is a big deal, that over just a couple of $100, they are killing people or almost killing people about taxing. Sometimes we use the phrase, oh, we're going to tar and feather so-and-so. But to tar and feather someone is a cruel and brutal act. We're talking that you would pour boiling tar, like the stuff you use like on the highway. It has to be boiling for it to be able to run and spread. And they would pour it over the top of someone's head so that it then comes on them. It's sticky, it's hot, it's going to produce, more than third-degree burns here. I mean, this is really, really hot. It's like the worst sunburn ever. And then they would put feathers on you, chicken, bird, whatever they had available, so that it would stick and it couldn't come off. And so you are literally boiling inside. A lot of people die from the internal injuries, that their skin overheats and it affects their vital organs, or they suffocate or something. I mean, this is truly a heinous, brutal, brutal act that these Sons and Daughters of Liberty sometimes do. A lot of times it's effigies, but they will, in fact, go after the actual people in some instances. So this Stamp Act is not something to take lightly. here, one of the quotes I think is really good about the Stamp Act is from one of our founding fathers. His name is Patrick Henry. We'll talk about him later. You'll read about him later. And he said on the Stamp Act, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I had Cromwell, George III may profit from their example. If this be treason, let's make the most of it. Talking about the Stamp Act. John Adams said, the die is now cast. I have passed the Rubicon. Swim or sink, live or die, survive or perish with my country will be my unalterable determination. And it really all does stem from the Stamp Act. So I want you to be thinking about this from both perspectives, from both the colonist perspective and from the British perspective. And King George III, because he truly doesn't know what to do with this unruly colony that all of a sudden decides they're kind of getting too big for their britches. And so I want you to be thinking of that while you read the chapters and go over the lecture this week. Working on exams, so far things are okay. I'm trying my very, very best to get them graded as quickly as possible for you, but in a manner that you will understand why you got the grade you got. And so it's taking just a little bit to grade the essays. But hang with me, and I'll see you guys later.